The telegram arrived at the worst possible moment. Olive Keating stood at the altar of the Redemption Creek Baptist Church on a blazing Saturday afternoon in June of 1882, her hands trembling so visibly that the dried wildflowers woven into her bouquet rattled against each other like tiny bones. The wooden pews were filled with nearly every soul in Redemption Creek, Texas ranchers and their sunburned wives, the blacksmith with his enormous hands folded in his lap, the schoolteacher dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The air smelled of beeswax candles and cedar, and the particular heat that gathered under a tin roof in the high summer of the Texas hill country. Beside her stood Harlan Briggs, her intended husband, dressed in a charcoal suit that had been shipped from San Antonio and pressed within an inch of its life. He was handsome in the way that a polished revolver was handsome, all surface gleam and deadly intent hiding underneath. He was smiling at Preacher Aldous in that practiced, confident way of his, the way of a man who had never once doubted that he would get exactly what he wanted. And then the church door crashed open. A boy of about 12 came skidding up the aisle, boots slapping against the floorboards, cheeks red as beetroot, waving a folded piece of yellow paper above his head like a flag of surrender. He was Tommy Pratt, the telegraph office runner, and every single person in that church turned to watch him come. "Telegram," he shouted, breathless and dramatic, unable to contain the importance of his errand. "Telegram for Miss Olive Keating, marked urgent, real urgent." The entire congregation held its breath. Harlan's smile did not waver, but something moved behind his pale blue eyes, something calculating and cold. Something that Olive would remember later and wonder why she had never noticed it before in all the months of their courtship. Tommy pressed the folded yellow paper into Olive's gloved hand, and she looked down at it, and the room was so quiet she could hear the candle flames guttering in their brass holders. She unfolded it. She read it once silently, and her face went perfectly still in the way that a lake goes still before a storm rolls in from the western horizon. And then she read it aloud. Her voice was steady, which surprised everyone, including herself. "Miss Keating," she read, the paper held in both hands so the congregation could see she was not hiding a single word. "Harlan Briggs is not free to marry you. He has a wife already living in Galveston. Her name is Clara Dearborn Briggs. They wed in 1879. I have the marriage certificate. I am sending it by post to Redemption Creek Sheriff Franklin Webb. Do not let them proceed. The marriage you are about to enter is a trap. The man beside you is a fraud and worse besides. You deserve the truth. Roy Vaughn." The church erupted. Women gasped and pressed hands to mouths. Men leaned forward in their pews. The blacksmith said something under his breath that a man really ought not to say in a house of God. Harlan Briggs's polished smile finally cracked, and underneath it was something ugly and exposed, like a rock turned over in the dirt. But Preacher Aldous, a tall, lean man of 62 with a white beard and the steady eyes of someone who had seen the worst and best of human nature in equal measure, simply cleared his throat. He looked at Harlan. He looked at Olive. And then he looked at the congregation over the rims of his spectacles with an expression of remarkable calm. "We will need to verify this claim before we proceed," he said. "But I will say this, Miss Keating, you are not a woman who can be married against her will or under false pretenses, not in this church, not while I am breathing." He folded his large hands together on his Bible. "The ceremony is paused." Harlan's face went the color of old ash. "This is slander," he said, his voice dropping to a register that Olive had never heard from him before, low and threatening and real. "Vaughn is a liar and a jealous man who cannot stand that Olive chose me." And Olive turned to look at him fully for the first time since the telegram arrived, and something inside her, something that had been quietly uneasy for months, quietly whispering warnings she had chosen not to hear, went very quiet and very certain. She set her bouquet of dried wildflowers down on the altar with the precise, deliberate care of a woman who has made a final decision. "I think," she said, that we had better send for Roy Vaughn. To understand why Roy Vaughn sent that telegram, and what it cost him to do it, you have to go back nearly a year, to the previous August, when the summer was at its most merciless and Olive Keating first came to Redemption Creek. She had come with her father, James Keating, a lean-limbed Irish-born cattleman who had spent 30 years scratching a living out of the Texas soil and whose lungs had finally begun to fail him. He needed to be in a smaller, quieter place than San Antonio, where the dust and the noise and the crowded streets had made his coughing worse. He needed somewhere with clean air and a manageable piece of land, and a community that might look after Olive when he was gone, because James Keating was not a man who deceived himself about the time he had left. Redemption Creek was exactly that kind of place. It sat in a valley between two limestone ridges, watered by a creek that ran clean and cold even in August, surrounded by live oaks and cedar and grassland that went amber in the late summer light. The town had a general store, a telegraph office, a doctor's surgery, a blacksmith, a livery, a church, a schoolhouse, and 2 saloons, one respectable and one less so. It had about 340 souls, and most of them knew each other's names and business with an intimacy that could be either comforting or suffocating, depending on your character. Roy Vaughn was a man who generally found it comforting. He had come to Redemption Creek 7 years before, in 1875, when he was 24 years old, riding in on a bay horse with a bedroll and a modest sum of money he had earned working cattle drives out of Abilene. He had bought 40 acres of limestone and grass from old Pete Sheridan, who was too old and too tired to work it anymore, and he had spent the following years building it into something genuinely good. The house he built was solid, made from cut limestone blocks hauled from the ridge, with a deep covered porch that ran the length of the front and caught the evening breeze off the creek. He ran a small herd of longhorns and kept a kitchen garden and a few chickens, and a pair of hounds named Pepper and Me. He was 31 now, with dark hair that had gone a little too long and brown eyes that the women of Redemption Creek had historically found worth discussing, and he had the kind of quiet steadiness that came from years of working alone and thinking carefully before he spoke. He was not a man who had expected to be thrown completely off his axis by the arrival of one James Keating and his daughter. They had come in on the stage from San Antonio on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of August, 1881, and Roy had been at the livery collecting his horse when the stage pulled up. He had seen plenty of new arrivals in Redemption Creek and had rarely given them much thought beyond a polite nod. But Olive Keating stepped down from that stage in a dust-covered blue traveling dress with her hair coming loose from its pins, and her chin lifted at that precise angle that said she was exhausted and uncomfortable, and not going to let anyone see it. And something in Roy's chest moved in a way he found both inconvenient and undeniable. She was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair and green eyes, and a quality of attention about her that made you feel, when she looked at you, that she was genuinely interested in what you were going to say, which Roy had found to be a rarer quality than it should have been. She was not beautiful in the way of a painting or a stage actress. She was beautiful in the way of a person who has a great deal of life behind their eyes and is not particularly interested in pretending otherwise. James Keating had bought the old Whitmore place, a modest stone house with a good well and a small pasture on the north edge of town, and within a week he and Olive had made it look lived in and comfortable in that way that speaks of people who know how to make a home rather than merely occupy a space. Roy had met them properly at church the following Sunday, had shaken James Keating's hand and said something forgettable about the weather, and had then spent an embarrassing amount of effort the following week thinking of a reason to speak to Olive again that would not seem transparent. The reason he eventually found was genuine enough. He had a fence line that bordered the creek on the east side of his property, and the posts had been rotting quietly for 2 years, and he finally addressed this problem by buying new cedar posts from the mill and spending 3 days replacing them in the August heat. The creek ran close to the edge of the Keating property, and on the second afternoon Olive came out to watch, not in an interfering way, but in the way of someone who finds the honest work of building and fixing things genuinely interesting. And she asked intelligent questions about the fence posts and the soil and the water rights along the creek. And by the end of the afternoon, they were sitting in the shade of a live oak and talking with the ease of people who have known each other considerably longer than 48 hours. That was how it began. Over the following weeks, they found reasons to be near each other with an increasing frequency that probably fooled no one in Redemption Creek, because Redemption Creek was exactly the kind of town where these things were noticed and discussed. Roy began leaving eggs from his chickens on the Keating porch, which was a modest and acceptable gesture. Olive began bringing Roy cornbread, and occasionally a jar of the blackberry preserves she made from the berries along the creek, which was slightly bolder and generated some approving comment from the older women of the congregation. James Keating watched this development with an expression that mixed paternal satisfaction with something more complicated worry, perhaps, or the particular ache of a father who loves his daughter and is running out of time to see her safely and happily settled. Roy and James took to talking on the Keating porch in the evenings, the older man in his rocking chair and Roy sitting on the porch steps, and James Keating talked about Ireland and about the cattle country, and about what Texas had demanded of him and what it had given back. And Roy listened with genuine attention, because James was a man who had lived carefully and thought deeply, and was worth listening to. James died on the 14th of November, 1881, on a cold, clear night that came in off the high country with a bite that everyone said was unusual for that early in the season. Olive had sent for Roy at dusk, and he had come immediately and sat with her through the night. And James Keating had died just before dawn with his daughter's hand in both of his, and a look of something that might have been peace on his deeply lined face. Roy had helped with the arrangements and had stood beside Olive at the burial, and had not said anything that day, because he understood that words were not what she needed. He had simply been there, solid and quiet and present, and Olive had gripped his arm during the service with a grip that said more than anything either of them could have put into language. In the weeks after her father's death, Olive was alone in the stone house on the north edge of town, and the community of Redemption Creek, as small communities do, closed around her with food and company and quiet kindness. Roy came every few days, never staying too long, never presuming. He fixed the gate latch on her pasture fence. He split a winter's worth of firewood and stacked it against the house wall. He brought Pepper and me to keep her company one afternoon, because he had noticed that the house was very quiet, and that Olive, who was not by nature a weeping woman, had a quality of stillness about her that concerned him more than tears would have. She told him, on a cold December afternoon with the cedar logs burning in her hearth and the two dogs sprawled between them like enormous rugs, about her father's fears for her. "He worried that I would be alone," she said, looking into the fire rather than at Roy. "He said Redemption Creek was the right kind of place, but that I would need to be careful about the kind of man I chose. He said," she paused, and something flickered across her face. "He said I was too trusting, that I was the kind of person who believed the best of people, and that this was a beautiful quality that could also be a dangerous one." Roy looked at her profile in the firelight, at the clean line of her jaw, and the way the light caught the small scar above her left eyebrow that she had told him came from falling out of an apple tree when she was 8 years old, and he felt something move through him with the certainty and force of a river in spring flood, the kind of certainty that you cannot argue with or dismiss or rationalize away. He did not say anything that afternoon about what he felt. It was too soon, and he was a careful man, and she was still grieving. But he carried the knowledge of it with him like a coal in his chest, warm and constant. What he could not have anticipated, what no amount of careful thinking had prepared him for, was Harlan Briggs. Harlan arrived in Redemption Creek in January of 1882, driving a good buggy with matched bays, dressed in clothes that said money without quite shouting it, which is a more sophisticated trick than it looks. He was 35, broad-shouldered, with a handsome face and very pale blue eyes, and a laugh that came easily and pleasantly, and that everyone initially found charming. He said he was from Austin, that he had made his money in land speculation, and was looking for investment opportunities in the hill country, and he carried himself with the specific confidence of a man who had never been told no in a way that stuck. He noticed Olive within his first week in Redemption Creek, which was not surprising because Olive was the kind of woman who got noticed, and he began paying her attention in the methodical way of a man running a campaign rather than falling in love. He brought her things. He complimented her house and her preserves and her intelligence in that careful order that suggested he had thought about the order. He was never inappropriate, never forward, always precisely and impeccably gentlemanly, in a way that was so perfect it should perhaps have been suspicious, but which mostly just seemed impressive. Roy watched this with an expression that the Redemption Creek Gossip Network described, with some accuracy, as a man trying very hard not to show that something is eating him alive, because Roy had not yet said anything to Olive. He had been careful and patient and respectful of her grief, and he had trusted that there would be time, and now there was Harlan Briggs with his matched bays and his Austin money and his easy laugh, and Olive was responding to him with a warmth that Roy could not blame her for, because Harlan was making a genuine and sustained effort and Roy had been making firewood piles and bringing dogs. He told himself this was not a competition. He told himself that if Olive was happy, that was what mattered. He sat in church every Sunday and watched Harlan sit beside Olive in the Keating pew, which James Keating had occupied alone for only 3 months before someone else filled it, and Roy's hands on his hymnal were quiet and still, and the coal in his chest burned with something that was no longer warmth alone. He finally said something to Olive in March, and the manner of it was not what he had planned, because Roy Vaughn had planned a conversation of some care and delicacy. But what happened was that he encountered her at the general store on a Tuesday afternoon, and they were both reaching for the same tin of dried beans and their hands touched on the shelf, and he looked at her and something in his face gave him completely away. And Olive looked back at him with those green eyes and said, quietly, "Roy," just his name, but in a tone that said she knew, that she had known for some time, and that she was telling him something with the single word, though what exactly she was telling him he could not be completely certain. He asked her to walk with him. They walked along the creek in the cold March afternoon, among the bare branches of the pecans and the green shimmer of the cedar, and Roy said, without particular elegance, that he cared for her very deeply, and that he should have said so sooner, and that he was not a man of great fortune, but that he was a man who would work every day of his life to make her comfortable and happy, and that the thought of her marrying anyone else was something he found difficult to reckon with. Olive listened to all of this with that quality of genuine attention that he had first noticed on the day they met, and then she said, with an honesty that was one of her central qualities, "I care for you too, Roy. I have for some months, but Harlan is—" She stopped. "Harlan is what?" Roy said, and he kept his voice even with some effort. "He has asked me formally to consider him," she said. "He has spoken to me about a future. He has been very clear about his intentions." "And you have been very—" She looked for the word, "careful." Roy heard the word and understood it precisely for what it was. He had been so careful not to presume, so careful not to pressure a grieving woman, so careful that he had left a gap into which another man had walked with perfect timing. "I see," he said. "I am not saying no to you," she said, and the honesty in her voice was painful to hear. "I am saying that I am uncertain, and that I need time to be certain." He gave her time. He gave her all of April, during which Harlan Briggs continued his methodical courtship, and Roy continued to exist on the edges of Olive's life with the quiet steadiness that had always been his most essential characteristic, showing up when she needed something, not showing up when she needed space, being exactly what he was without performance or pretension. What he did not do during April was share what he had begun to learn about Harlan Briggs. It had started with a letter from a friend in Austin, a man named Caleb Marsh who had done trail driving with Roy in the 70s and who now worked as a clerk in a land office in the capital. Roy had written to Caleb in late March, asking him to make inquiries about Harlan Briggs and his land speculation interests, not out of malice, but out of the particular instinct of a careful man who had looked into Harlan Briggs's pale blue eyes and found that the bottom was not where he expected it to be. Caleb's first letter came back in early April and was inconclusive. Harlan Briggs was known in Austin, had done some land dealing, nothing obviously criminal. But there was something in Caleb's phrasing, nothing obviously criminal rather than nothing criminal, that struck Roy as deliberately careful. He wrote back and asked Caleb to dig deeper. Meanwhile, Olive said yes to Harlan Briggs in the second week of May, and the announcement was made in church on the following Sunday, and Redemption Creek treated it with the enthusiasm that small towns treat any piece of news that allows for genuine communal celebration. There was a party at the Hendersons' ranch, and a great deal of dancing and food and toasting, and Roy attended because not attending would have been conspicuous, and also because he genuinely could not stay away. He danced with Olive once, a proper and public waltz, and he held her hand in the proper and public fashion, and she looked at him over his shoulder with an expression he could not entirely read, something complicated and a little sad, and also something else, something that perhaps she was not quite ready to name. "Are you happy?" he said quietly, not cruelly, just asking. "I think I will be," she said, which was not the same thing, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. Caleb Marsh's second letter arrived on the 20th of May, and Roy sat at his kitchen table and read it twice before he put it down. The letter said that Harlan Briggs had married a woman named Clara Dearborn in Galveston in October of 1879, that the marriage was on record at the Galveston County Courthouse, that Harlan and Clara had separated in early 1881 after he had run through a significant portion of her family's money in failed land speculation ventures, real ones, not the successful business story he told in Redemption Creek. That Clara Dearborn Briggs was still living, residing with her family in Galveston, and had not divorced Harlan Briggs because divorce in Texas in 1882 was a complicated and expensive legal proceeding, and because the Dearborn family was a church-going family that did not readily use the word. That Harlan Briggs was, therefore, already married, and that any marriage he entered into in Redemption Creek would be a crime, specifically bigamy. Caleb also wrote that he had obtained a copy of the marriage certificate through a contact at the Galveston courthouse and was mailing it under separate cover to the sheriff of Redemption Creek. Roy sat at his kitchen table for a long time after reading this. He was not a man given to dramatic gestures. His first instinct was to go to Olive directly, to put the letter in her hands and tell her what he had learned. But he thought about how it would look, the man she had not chosen, bringing evidence against the man she had chosen on the eve of their wedding. He thought about her father's words which she had relayed to him, too trusting, the kind of person who believed the best of people. He thought about Harlan's pale blue eyes and the specific coldness that lived behind them. He wrote to Caleb and asked him to also contact the Galveston sheriff and obtain a formal sworn statement. He wrote to the Galveston courthouse himself. He wrote, after considerable hesitation, directly to Clara Dearborn Briggs's family in Galveston, explaining the situation as plainly and respectfully as he could. The wedding was announced for the last Saturday of June. The marriage certificate that Caleb was sending by post would not arrive before then. Roy knew this because he had calculated the timing carefully, the way a man does when something matters enormously and he is trying very hard to get it right. He had one option, the telegram. He sent it on the morning of the wedding, from the Redemption Creek telegraph office, addressed to Olive Keating at the Baptist church, at the moment that the ceremony would have just begun. He paid Tommy Pratt an extra 50 cents to run it to the church the instant it came in, and to put it directly into Olive's hands and no one else's. He had not told Olive he was doing this. He had not told anyone. He had wrestled with the ethics of it all night, sitting on his porch in the dark while Pepper and me slept at his feet, and the creek made its quiet sound in the distance, and the stars came and went behind high, thin clouds. He had thought about secrets and betrayal, and the dark past that Harlan Briggs was carrying, and what it meant for Olive's future. He had thought about whether this was a forced choice he had any right to impose on her. He had concluded by dawn that the right thing and the convenient thing were the same thing in this particular case, which was a rarer alignment than most people realized, and that the rare alignment was worth trusting. He had gone home from the telegraph office and put on his good shirt, the dark blue linen one he had bought in San Antonio the previous autumn, and his good boots, and he had brushed his hat, and he had ridden to the Baptist church. He was standing in the back of the churchyard when Tommy Pratt came running. He was still standing there, very still, his hat in his hands, when he heard Olive's voice begin to read. When the uproar in the church reached its full volume and Preacher Aldous called for calm with the authority of 62 years and a very large Bible, Harlan Briggs turned to Olive with an expression that mixed wounded dignity with cold calculation, and said, in the voice Roy had never heard before, the low, threatening, real one, "You are making a catastrophic mistake. Vaughn is a jealous man who has fabricated this entire story because he cannot accept that you preferred me. There is no Clara Dearborn. There is no marriage, and when this is shown to be the lie it is, you will have made yourself a fool in front of every person in this town." Olive looked at him and said nothing. This silence, Roy would learn later, was more devastating than anything she could have said, because it was the silence of a woman in whom the last doubt had finally resolved. The church door opened and Roy walked in. There are rooms that know when something important is about to happen, or at least the people in them do, and the whole congregation turned to watch Roy Vaughn walk up the center aisle of the Redemption Creek Baptist Church in his blue linen shirt, his hat in his hands, his brown eyes going directly to Olive and staying there. He stopped at the foot of the altar steps. Harlan Briggs looked at him with a hatred so naked and unguarded that several women in the front pew made small sounds of alarm. "Vaughn," Harlan said. "Briggs," Roy said. "Everything in that telegram is a lie." "No," Roy said, with the particular quiet of a man who has spent all night arriving at a certainty. "It is not." He reached into his shirt pocket and produced Caleb's letter, and then he looked at Preacher Aldous and said, "I have a friend in Austin who has done the research. His name is Caleb Marsh. He works in a land office and he is a man of standing and his word means something. He has written down what he found. I would like you to read this, Preacher." Aldous took the letter and read it without haste. The congregation was so quiet that the creek could be heard through the thin church walls, running over its limestone bed outside. Aldous looked up from the letter and looked at Harlan Briggs with an expression that contained no heat at all, which was somehow more final than anger would have been. "Mr. Briggs," he said, "I am going to ask you to leave this church." "I will not." "You will," said Sheriff Franklin Webb, who had been sitting in the third pew and who now rose to his considerable height, and set his hat on his silver-haired head with the calm deliberation of a man who has been a lawman for 20 years and has nothing left to prove to anyone. "I will see you to the door, Mr. Briggs, and then I think we need to have a considerable conversation." Harlan Briggs looked around the church, at the congregation, at Aldous, at Webb, at Roy, and finally at Olive, and in the last look was something that might, in another man, have been regret, but which in Harlan's face looked more like the rage of a man who has lost a game he thought was already won. He straightened his charcoal jacket. He walked to the door. Sheriff Webb followed, close enough that the message was unmistakable. The church door closed behind them. The congregation sat in the peculiar stunned silence of people who have just watched something very large and very real happen in a space usually reserved for the quieter business of the sacred. Olive stood at the altar with her bouquet of dried wildflowers on the wooden rail beside her, and she looked at Roy Vaughn standing at the foot of the altar steps, and the expression on her face was something that no one in the congregation would be able to describe precisely afterward, though they would all try for years, sitting on porches and in the general store and at the Sunday dinner tables of Redemption Creek. Roy looked back at her and did not look away. Preacher Aldous said, very gently, "Olive, would you like a few minutes?" "No," Olive said. And then, while everyone held their breath, she walked down the 2 altar steps and stood directly in front of Roy Vaughn, close enough that he could see the exact shade of green her eyes were in the afternoon light coming through the church's south window, and she said, in a voice steady enough that everyone heard it clearly, "You knew for weeks." "I was getting the evidence in order," he said. "I wanted to be sure. You could have told me. I know. Instead, you waited until the last possible moment and sent a telegram." "I know. Why?" she said, and the word was not angry, it was genuinely asking. Roy was quiet for a moment in the absolute silence of 330-odd witnesses. "Because I was afraid," he said, "that if I came to you privately with it, you would think I was only doing it because I wanted you for myself. And I wanted you to have a choice. A real one in front of everyone, where the truth was public and no one could pressure you or persuade you in private. I wanted the truth to be yours, not mine." Olive looked at him for a long moment. "That is either the most considerate thing anyone has ever done for me," she said, "or the most complicated." "Possibly both," Roy said. Something passed across Olive's face that began as something very serious and became, incrementally, a smile, a small one but genuine, the kind that comes from a place deep enough that it cannot be manufactured. "Roy Vaughn," she said, "I am standing at an altar in a church full of witnesses in my wedding dress on what has turned out to be a very significant day." "I am aware," Roy said. "I would like," Olive said carefully, "to not have wasted the dress entirely." The church went so quiet that the cedar pews seemed to be holding their breath, along with everyone sitting in them. Roy's expression changed in a way that moved through about 6 different things in the space of 3 seconds, ending somewhere that looked very much like wonder. Preacher Aldous cleared his throat. He looked at Roy over his spectacles. He looked at Olive. He opened his Bible. "I believe," he said, with the magnificent composure of a man who has been a preacher in the Texas Hill Country for 35 years and has learned that the Lord works in ways that are frequently, genuinely extraordinary, "that we have some unfinished business." Roy said quickly, "She has not formally, I mean to say, I haven't. We should probably—" "Roy Vaughn," Olive said, and she held out her hand. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He thought about the fence posts and the firewood and the eggs and the December afternoon in front of the fire and the March walk along the cold creek and the May waltz and the long night on the porch watching the stars come and go. He took her hand. The congregation erupted, but differently this time. A wave of sound that was pure and human and joyful, the sound of people who have been through something frightening and have come out the other side into something they had not expected to be so moved by. Preacher Aldous said, with quiet authority, "We will need a proper license before I can pronounce anything official. But let us say what needs to be said today and the paperwork can follow." "Preacher," Roy said, "you are a wise man." "I have had considerable practice," Aldous said. And so on that blazing June afternoon in 1882, with the sun coming through the south window of the Redemption Creek Baptist Church in a long slant of gold, Preacher Aldous spoke words that were formal and beautiful and old, and the congregation sang a hymn that nobody had planned for but everyone seemed to know, and Olive Keating and Roy Vaughn stood at the altar and said things to each other that would shape the rest of their lives. They did not exchange rings. Roy had not brought a ring because he had not come to the church intending this, not entirely, not with certainty. He had come hoping in the careful and restrained way that was his nature, but not certain. "The ring," Olive said afterward in the churchyard in the afternoon light, while the congregation swirled around them in a warm tide of handshakes and embraces and excited commentary, "is not the part that matters." "What part is?" Roy said. Olive looked at him with those green eyes that had been looking at him with increasing depth for nearly a year. The part where you spent months getting the evidence right so that the choice would be genuinely mine, she said. That part. Roy found he could not say anything to this that would improve on the silence. He kissed her instead, which was, for a man who had been operating under the strictest social conventions for the better part of a year, a notable departure, and which the remaining members of the congregation who were still in the churchyard received with the kind of cheering that made the horses at the hitching rail lift their heads in alarm. The formal and legal wedding ceremony took place 12 days later, on a Monday morning, when the license had been obtained from the county seat, and everything was in the proper order that Preacher Aldous required. It was a small ceremony, only a handful of people, because the large occasion had already been had. Roy wore the blue linen shirt again, because Olive told him she preferred it to a suit, and Olive wore a pale green dress the color of new grass that she had been keeping in her cedar chest for an occasion worthy of it, and they stood in the empty church in the morning light and said the words again, this time with all the correct legal standing behind them. Preacher Aldous said, when he had pronounced them husband and wife, I have married several hundred people in this church. I do not think any two of them arrived at this altar by a more interesting route. We will try to be less dramatic going forward, Roy said. No, you will not, Aldous said, but that is perfectly fine. The matter of Harlan Briggs resolved itself with the grinding inevitability of consequences. Sheriff Webb held him in the Redemption Creek jail on the night of the first wedding and telegraphed the Galveston sheriff the following morning. The marriage certificate that Caleb Marsh had mailed arrived 6 days later, and when it did, there was no longer any ambiguity. Harlan Briggs was charged with bigamy in Galveston County and transported there by the Galveston Sheriff's deputy 2 weeks after the events at the church. Roy received a letter from Clara Dearborn Briggs's father 3 weeks later, a dignified and clearly painful letter from a man who had been protecting his daughter from a dark secret, and who was grateful that it had been exposed before the situation compounded itself further. The letter said that Clara was well, that she intended to pursue a legal dissolution of her marriage now that Harlan's character was a matter of public record, and that the Dearborn family appreciated Roy Vaughan's efforts to prevent another woman from falling into the same trap. Roy showed the letter to Olive, who read it quietly and then folded it and put it away and said, I want to write to her. To Clara. She is not to blame for any of this, Olive said, and I suspect she has been very lonely and very afraid for a long time. I would like her to know that there is at least one person who does not hold what happened against her. Roy looked at his wife. The word still had a quality of mild amazement when he applied it to her, and thought that this was exactly the kind of person she was, and that he was a very fortunate man. Olive wrote to Clara Dearborn Briggs in Galveston, and Clara wrote back, and the two women maintained a correspondence for several years, which was, Olive said, one of the genuinely good things to come out of the whole affair. They moved into Roy's limestone house at the end of July, which had been built for one but had a quality of spaciousness that responded well to intention. Olive brought what was worth bringing from the Keating house and put it in Roy's house with the same careful attention she had given to making the Keating house a home, and within a week the limestone house felt as if it had always contained both of them. She kept the Keating house and rented it to a young schoolteacher named Margaret Cross, who had come to Redemption Creek in September of 1882 to teach in the schoolhouse, and who proved to be an excellent tenant and eventually a genuine friend. The first year of their marriage was the year that Roy Vaughan learned, with considerable pleasure and some productive surprise, what it meant to share a life with someone who was his intellectual and practical equal in every area and his considerable superior in several. Olive had a head for numbers and accounts that exceeded Roy's own, and she took over the keeping of the ranch books with an efficiency that immediately revealed that Roy had been losing small amounts of money in irregular ways for years, because he had been too busy working the land to pay proper attention to the ledger. She identified 3 areas of unnecessary expense and 2 areas where he was underselling his beef. And by the end of the first year, the ranch was running materially better than it had before. She also had opinions about the kitchen garden, which Roy had managed on the principle of planting whatever seemed like a good idea and seeing what survived, and she reorganized it on a rotating system she had read about in a farming almanac, and which produced results so dramatically superior to Roy's previous method that he felt both impressed and somewhat humbled. Roy, for his part, brought to their shared life a quality of steadiness that Olive found she relied on in ways she had not anticipated. He was not a man who panicked, and there were moments in that first year when the world offered reasonable cause for panic. A drought in August that threatened the summer grass, a fence break that let half the herd onto the neighboring Henderson Range and required 2 full days of cooperative cattle sorting to resolve, and an illness in October that laid Olive low for 10 days with a fever that was serious enough that Roy sent for the doctor twice and did not sleep in his own bed for the duration. Sitting instead in the chair by the bedroom door, with a book open in his hands that he was not reading. "You do not have to stay up all night," Olive said on the 3rd night when she was past the worst of it and her fever had broken and she could speak clearly again. "I'm not staying up all night," Roy said with the particular stubbornness of a very tired man who is committed to a position he has already staked. "You are not even reading that book," she said. He looked at the book. He looked at her. "I have been reading it," he said. "You have been holding it," she said. "What page are you on?" He checked. He had been on the same page since midnight. "Go to sleep, Roy," Olive said, and her voice was warm and fond and exhausted in equal parts. "When your temperature is normal," he said. She sighed, and he could hear the smile in it even through the exhaustion. He stayed in the chair until morning, when the October sun came through the bedroom window and the doctor came, and said the fever was completely gone, and Roy Vaughn finally went to sleep in his own bed at 9 in the morning with the autumn light on his face. And Olive watched him sleeping, and felt something so large and settled and permanent move through her that she understood, in a way that transcended reasoning, that whatever she had felt during the months of their courtship, the uncertainty, the competing pulls, the careful weighing of one man against another, was nothing like what she felt now. She felt as though she had arrived somewhere. They did not talk about it directly. They were not, either of them, people who reached for dramatic declarations when they had already said the important things with actions. But it lived between them, present and warm, in the way they moved around each other in the limestone house and the kitchen garden and along the creek, in the ease of their silences and the quality of their conversations, in the way Roy's hand found hers without calculation when they walked anywhere, and in the way Olive leaned into his shoulder when they sat on the porch in the evenings watching the last light go copper and amber over the limestone ridges. The following spring, which was 1883, Olive told Roy on a morning in April that they were going to have a child. Roy was at the kitchen table with his coffee and the accounts ledger, and he put his coffee cup down with great care, as a man does when his hands have become unreliable, and he looked at her with an expression so undisguised and unguarded and full that Olive, who was not a woman who cried easily or often, felt her eyes sting. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am certain," she said. He stood up and came to where she was standing by the kitchen window in the morning light, and he held her face in both hands with a gentleness that was also a kind of reverence, and he said, "Olive." "Roy," she said, in exactly the tone he had heard on the day in the general store when their hands had touched on the shelf, and everything had been true in her face before either of them said it out loud. Their son was born in November of 1883, in the same limestone house, delivered by Dr. Elia's car with Margaret Cross in attendance, a circumstance which established a friendship between Margaret and Olive of the kind that only the particular intimacy of that shared experience can create. Roy was in the front room during the labor, and the quality of his stillness during those hours was so absolute that Pepper and me lay flat on the floor on either side of him, and did not move either, as though they understood that this was a moment that required everything. When Dr. Carr opened the bedroom door and said, "Mr. Vaughn, you have a son," Roy walked into the bedroom and looked at Olive sitting up against the pillows with the baby in her arms, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them with an expression that had no name in any language he knew. "James," Olive said. "I would like to call him James." Roy put his finger into the baby's tiny fist, which closed around it with a grip that was surprisingly powerful for a person who had been in the world for approximately 45 minutes, and he said, "James Keating Vaughn." "Yes," Olive said. James Keating Vaughn grew into a boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's quiet stubbornness, which combination created a person of considerable depth and tenacity. He was crawling by February, walking by August, and talking in complete and sometimes startlingly coherent sentences by the following spring, which the women of Redemption Creek regarded as definitive evidence that he had inherited Olive's intelligence and Roy's economy of expression in roughly equal measure. The ranch continued to grow. Roy added 15 acres on the south side in 1884, bought from a neighbor who was moving to Colorado, and the additional pasture supported a larger herd. Olive's management of the accounts had by now moved beyond the ranch itself into a modest but genuine business of its own. She had a talent for understanding supply and demand in the small specific world of a hill country town, and she had begun, discreetly, to lend money to small enterprises in Redemption Creek at fair interest, which generated a quiet return and also made her a person of genuine financial influence in the community, which she exercised with the same care and ethical clarity she brought to everything. Margaret Cross, the schoolteacher, had by 1884 become a fixture in their lives in the way that a few close friends do present at the table on Sunday evenings, part of the easy conversation on the porch, trusted with James when Olive needed her hands free for ranch business. She was a small, sharp-minded woman from Missouri with an inexhaustible intellectual curiosity and a dry humor that Roy particularly appreciated. In the late spring of 1884, a man named William Carr, no relation to the doctor, came to Redemption Creek to set up a newspaper, the first the town had had, a weekly paper he called the Redemption Creek Clarion. He was 31, lean and ink-stained and earnest, with the particular absorbed quality of a person for whom ideas are more naturally interesting than things, and he arrived at the schoolhouse to interview Margaret Cross about the state of education in the hill country with his notebook and his pen and his genuine attention. And what happened between them over the following months was, Roy observed to Olive on the porch one October evening, approximately as inevitable as sunrise. "Margaret would say she is not the kind of woman who falls easily," Olive said, watching the lamplight in the schoolhouse across the creek. "She would be wrong," Roy said. Olive smiled. "She would be furious to hear you say that." "Probably." Margaret Cross and William Carr were married in the Redemption Creek Baptist Church in January of 1885, and preacher Aldous, who by now had developed a specific private theory that the events of June 1882 had done something to the romantic atmosphere of his church, presided with his usual magnificent composure. Roy and Olive stood up with them, Roy as William's best man and Olive as Margaret's witness. And the wedding was warm and simple and genuine in the way of people who have gotten to the truth of each other without particular drama, which made it, in its own way, just as powerful as the more dramatic variety. Life in Redemption Creek in the 1880s was shaped by forces larger than any individual life, and the Vaughns were not untouched by these. The drought of 1886 was severe, one of the worst in the hill country's living memory, and it took the summer grass down to brown nothing and drove water levels in the creek to the lowest anyone had seen. Roy sold 2/3 of the herd rather than watch them suffer, at prices that were painful, and the following year they rebuilt from the remaining nucleus. The drought also brought harder truths to the surface. The Comanche, who had been the sovereign people of this land for generations before men like Roy and James Keating and Harlan Briggs, and all the rest arrived and claimed pieces of it for themselves, had been confined to reservation lands in Indian Territory after the Red River War of 1874–1875, and the violence and dispossession of that history was something that Olive in particular thought about and talked about with Roy, who had grown up hearing the one-sided version of that story, and who listened to his wife's more complicated telling of it with the care of a man who understands that the truth is frequently more demanding than the comfortable version. They did not pretend that the land they lived on had been empty before they came to it. They did not pretend that the comfortable life they were building existed in a moral vacuum. These were not easy truths, and there was no clean resolution to them, only the ongoing effort to see clearly and act with as much fairness and decency as the situation allowed. Roy's relationship with old Pete Sheridan, the man he had bought his original 40 acres from in 1875, was part of this education. Pete had come west as a young man and had seen things Roy had not, and Pete had a complicated conscience about all of it, and his conversations with Roy over the years had introduced Roy to a version of Western history that the comfortable mythology omitted. Roy was grateful for it, even when it was uncomfortable, especially when it was uncomfortable. Their second child was born in the spring of 1886, in the middle of the drought year, which was not ideal timing but was, as Olive observed, not something they had had complete control over. It was a girl this time, delivered in the same limestone bedroom with the same doctor and the same Margaret Cross in attendance. They named her Frances after Roy's mother, who had died of fever on the cattle drive north when Roy was 17, and whom he had not spoken of to many people, but had spoken of to Olive, one evening in the first winter of their marriage, in a way that had moved her deeply. Frances Vaughan arrived in March 1886 with dark hair like her father and an expression that suggested she had opinions about the world and intended to make them known, which proved accurate. She was a quick, lively, opinionated child who could argue with her older brother James with a sophistication that exceeded her years, and who had from her earliest childhood a quality of determined presence that made rooms feel different when she was in them. James adored her. Roy was, in the way of fathers with daughters, entirely undone by her from the first moment. Olive watched this with deep amusement and occasional firm intervention when Roy's indulgence exceeded reasonable limits. "You cannot give her everything she asks for," Olive said, one evening when Roy had caved, for the third consecutive time, to Frances's request to stay up past her bedtime and listen to one more story. "I have not given her everything," Roy said, with the slightly beleaguered dignity of a man who knows he is on weak ground. "I draw the line somewhere." "Where?" Olive said. Roy thought about this. "I have not given her a horse yet," he said. "She is 3 years old," Olive said. "A fact that has not deterred her from asking," Roy said. Olive looked at him with those green eyes that had been looking at him now for 5 years, and that had lost none of their ability to see exactly who he was and find it, on balance, sufficient. "You are going to give her a horse," Olive said. "Not until she is at least 5, Roy said. Frances got her horse at 4.5, a small gentle gray that Roy acquired from Henderson's ranch, and that Frances named Biscuit with the serene authority of a person who does not doubt their own judgment. The late 1880s brought changes to Redemption Creek. The railroad came through 20 miles to the south in 1887, which changed the economics of cattle ranching in the hill country significantly. It was now possible to move cattle to market in San Antonio with considerably more speed and less loss than the long trail drives had allowed. Roy invested in the infrastructure required to use this advantage, adding loading pens and a proper corral system, and the ranch entered a period of steady, unglamorous prosperity that Roy found deeply satisfying. William Carr's Redemption Creek Clarion grew from a 4-page weekly into an 8-page paper, that covered not just local affairs but the wider world, and Olive became one of its regular contributors in 1887, writing a column on agriculture and ranch management that drew readers from across the county, and that eventually attracted the attention of a farming publication in San Antonio, which reprinted several of her pieces. Roy read everything she published with the specific pride of a man who has always known that his wife is remarkable, and finds it gratifying, if not surprising, when the rest of the world comes to the same conclusion. In 1888, preacher Aldous retired from the Baptist Church at the age of 68 and went to live with his daughter in Austin. The town threw him a dinner that lasted until well past midnight, and at which a great many people said things about what Aldous had meant to them that Aldous received with his characteristic composure and slightly damp eyes. Roy and Olive said their piece, which was more than most because Aldous was more to them than he was to most, being the man who had spoken the words that made their marriage real on that extraordinary June afternoon 6 years before. Aldous took Roy's hand and held it for a moment and said, "You are a good man, Roy Vaughn. You were always a good man. I am glad you found a woman who was worth being good for." Roy said, "She found me more accurately." Aldous said, "The best ones always do." The 1890s arrived and brought with them a country that was changing fast, the frontier closing around the edges, the Wild West of the dime novels becoming something already nostalgic in its own lifetime. The Texas Hill Country in the early 90s was neither entirely settled nor entirely wild. It existed in the long middle ground of an established community, still carrying the habits and memories of harder times, doing the steady work of building something that would last. Roy and Olive's third child came in the autumn of 1891, a boy they named Patrick, who arrived in the world with his mother's green eyes and his mother's quality of genuine attention, and who grew into a gentle, thoughtful child, with a passion for the natural world that expressed itself in long, solitary walks along the creek, and a collection of animal skulls and feathers and interesting stones that he kept on a shelf in his bedroom with the seriousness of a small scientist. James, now 8, was already working alongside Roy on the ranch with the earnest competence of a boy who has grown up watching work done carefully and wants to do it the same way. Frances, 5, was riding Biscuit with a skill that exceeded anyone's expectation, and Roy watched her from the fence with the specific look of a man who is both proud and slightly terrified. "She has no fear," Roy said to Olive, watching Frances take Biscuit over the small log jump she had constructed in the pasture. "She has fear," Olive said, standing beside him at the fence. "She simply chooses not to be governed by it." Roy glanced at her. "She gets that from you," he said. Olive considered this. "I would say she gets it from both of us," she said. "I was the one who read the telegram aloud in front of the whole church." "You were," Roy said. "That was terrifying," Olive said. "I was going to say remarkable." "It was both," Olive said, and her shoulder pressed against his arm in that easy habitual way of their long closeness. Roy and Olive Vaughn were known in Redemption Creek, by the early 1890s, as one of those couples that the community takes a quiet pride in, not because they were showy or spectacular, but because they had a quality of genuine partnership that people found reassuring about the general possibility of things. They disagreed, sometimes strongly, and they resolved it, always eventually. They had gone through hard things and come out on the other side still moving in the same direction. The summer of 1893 brought a piece of news that arrived, as significant news often does, at an unexpected moment. Olive was in the kitchen garden in July when Margaret Cross, now Margaret Carr, with 2 children of her own, came through the gate with an expression that mixed sympathy with something else. "I have heard something," Margaret said without preamble, because she was not a woman who did preamble, "about Harlan Briggs." Olive set down her garden trowel. "Tell me." The news was this. Harlan Briggs had been convicted of bigamy in Galveston in 1883, had served 18 months in the Galveston County Jail, and had been released in 1885. He had subsequently been involved in a series of land fraud schemes across the Texas coast and had finally been indicted in 1892 on 3 counts of fraud and 1 count of extortion. He had been convicted and was currently serving 5 years in the Huntsville State Penitentiary. Clara Dearborn Briggs had obtained a legal dissolution of her marriage in 1884, the year after his bigamy conviction, and had remarried in 1887, a man named George Parks, a Galveston ship chandler, with whom she was by all accounts genuinely happy. Olive went inside and wrote to Clara that afternoon, a short, warm letter that said, among other things, that she was glad Clara had found her way to peace, and that she thought of her sometimes, and that she hoped the letter found her well. Clara's reply came back 3 weeks later, and it was, by any measure, a genuinely happy letter from a genuinely happy woman, and it closed a door that had been standing ajar for 11 years with a quiet and permanent grace. Olive showed the letter to Roy, who read it with the particular expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific loose thread to be properly tied off. "Good," he said, and then, because he was Roy Vaughn and this covered everything he needed to say about it, he folded the letter and handed it back to her and went out to check on the cattle. In the late summer of 1894, Roy and Olive rode up to the limestone ridge on the north side of their property on a Sunday afternoon, a thing they had taken to doing once or twice a year when the weather and the ranch schedule permitted, leaving the children with Margaret Carr for the afternoon. There was a place on the ridge where the cedar opened into a small flat of native grass with a long view to the south and west, the hill country rolling away in ridges of blue and gray and green to the horizon, and they had found this place in the first year of their marriage and made it into a habitual destination. They tied the horses to cedar branches and sat on the limestone flat, and the afternoon was golden in the way of Texas September, the heat reduced to something gentle, the sky a deep and particular blue. Olive leaned against Roy's shoulder and Roy's arm went around her and they sat for a long time without speaking, watching the light move across the ridges in the way it does in the late afternoon, slowly and with authority. "Roy," Olive said. "Yes," Roy said. "Do you ever think about how different it might have been?" He understood what she was asking. He considered it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to consider things. "Sometimes," he said, "I think about the timing of it. If Caleb's letter had come a week later, if I had decided not to send the telegram, if Preacher Aldous had been a different kind of man, if I had been a different kind of woman," Olive said. "You could not have been a different kind of woman," Roy said. "It is not in you." Olive turned her head to look at him from the angle that had been familiar to her for 13 years now, the angle of his jaw and the length of his nose and the particular quality of attention in his brown eyes when he was looking at something he found worth looking at. "What do you mean?" she said. "Reading that telegram aloud," Roy said. "You did not hesitate. You did not look to anyone for guidance. You unfolded it and you read it aloud because you understood that if the truth was going to matter, it had to be public truth. You could not have done it differently. It is simply who you are." Olive was quiet for a moment. "My father said I was too trusting," she said. "Your father was wrong about that one thing," Roy said. "You are exactly trusting enough. You trusted the truth. You trusted Preacher Aldous. You trusted me." He paused. "Even though I made you read about it in a telegram at the altar." Olive laughed, a real laugh, the laugh he had been hearing for 13 years, and that still had the quality of something that made the world feel like a better organized place. "You are never going to fully escape responsibility for that," she said. "I know," Roy said. "I have made my peace with it." "Have you?" "It worked," Roy said. "I find that in retrospect the method is defensible when the outcome is undeniably good." Olive considered this. "That is a very convenient moral framework." "It is," Roy agreed. She settled more firmly against his shoulder, and the September light continued its slow passage across the limestone ridges, and the horses moved quietly in the cedar shade behind them, and the particular quality of peace that had been building in both of them for 13 years was present in the afternoon like something solid and real and permanent. 3 children, Olive said. 3, Roy confirmed. A ranch that is better than it was. Considerably. Margaret and William. And there too. Preacher Aldous retired in Austin. Writing his memoirs last I heard. I would like to read them, Olive said. I expect we will feature in a chapter, Roy said. He always said we were his most interesting wedding. He pronounced us husband and wife without a license, Olive said. That is technically irregular. He waited for the license, Roy said. He is a scrupulous man. He paused the ceremony and made Harlan Briggs leave the church and then married us anyway, Olive said. In the same afternoon. Which is, Roy said, exactly what the situation required. Olive tilted her head back to look at the sky, deep blue above the ridge. I love you, Roy Vaughn, she said, in the direct and uncomplicated way she had, the way that meant it was simply true and not a thing she felt required dressing up. Roy pressed his lips to the top of her head, against her chestnut hair, which was still dark and thick, though there was now a strand or two of silver near the temples that she said were her father's contribution, and which Roy found beautiful. I have loved you, he said, since the August afternoon you came down off the stage from San Antonio and lifted your chin at the dust, and the heat with a look that said you intended to make something fine out of whatever this place had to offer. Olive was quiet for a moment. You saw me get off the stage, she said. I was at the livery, he said. You never told me that. It seemed presumptuous to mention, Roy said. Olive sat up and looked at him. You watched me arrive in Redemption Creek and did not say a word about it for 13 years. I mentioned the livery once, Roy said. You did not mention what you were thinking at the livery. No, Roy said. I thought it was better to show than to tell. Olive looked at him with those green eyes for a long moment, the September light on both their faces, the hill country stretching away beneath the ridge in all its complicated and beautiful complexity. You are the most infuriating patient man I have ever known, she said. Yes, Roy said. I am glad you sent the telegram, she said. So am I, he said. I am glad I read it aloud. I knew you would, he said. That was why I sent it to you specifically, rather than to Preacher Aldous or Sheriff Webb. I knew you would read it aloud. I knew you were the kind of woman who would make the truth public rather than private. Olive looked at him and understood, in a way she had not entirely understood before, the full architecture of what he had done that day. Not just the months of careful research and the letter to Caleb and the telegram itself, but the specific choice to put the truth in her hands rather than in the hands of the preacher or the law, to make her the one who decided what to do with it, to give her the agency that Harlan had been attempting to remove from her since the beginning of his calculated courtship. She found she could not say anything for a moment. Roy watched her face and did not say anything either, because they were both of them people who understood that some things do not need words and are not improved by them. The light went on moving across the ridges. The horses breathed quietly in the cedar shade. The creek, far below the ridge, ran over its limestone bed and made its permanent sound, which was the sound of water that had been doing this for longer than anyone could measure, and would go on doing it long after the people on the ridge had become part of the limestone themselves. Olive pressed her hand flat against Roy's chest, over his heart, the way she sometimes did in the evenings on the porch, a gesture so habitual between them that it had become its own language. Roy put his hand over hers and held it there. They rode back down the ridge in the late afternoon, when the light was going amber and the cedar shadows were long on the ground, and they came into the yard of the limestone house to find James and Francis and Patrick running toward them across the pasture, because Margaret Carr had been watching from the Keating house porch and had seen them coming down the ridge road and had said, "Go meet your parents." James reached them first, long-legged and earnest at 10, and Roy swung down from his horse and caught him in one arm. And then Francis arrived at a dead run, dark braids flying, and Roy caught her in the other arm. And Patrick toddled behind, shorter and slower, and Olive was already off her horse and scooping him up. And they stood in the pasture in the last amber light of the September afternoon, The four of them and the two horses and the two hounds who had come bounding from the porch. And it was, by any possible measure, exactly what a life should look like when it has been built carefully and tended honestly and shared with the right person. Margaret stood on the Keating house porch across the creek and watched this, and when William came to stand beside her, he had arrived from the newspaper office. Ink on his fingers as usual, she said. "Look." William looked. "Yes," he said. "That is what we are building," Margaret said. "I know," William said, and took her hand. Olive put Patrick down, and he immediately ran at the dogs, which was his habitual response to their presence, and the dogs bore it with their customary dignity. Frances extracted herself from Roy's arm and went to check on Biscuit in the small paddock, because Frances's first concern upon returning home was always Biscuit. James stayed beside Roy, and they walked together toward the house in that side-by-side way they had, the boy already developing the same easy gait as his father. Roy held the porch door open for Olive, and she went inside into the warm smell of the limestone house cedar and beeswax, and the dried herbs she kept in bundles near the kitchen window. And she went to the stove to start supper, and Roy went to the well to draw water, and the ordinary beautiful machinery of their life resumed with the reliability of the creek and the limestone and the September sky. That evening after supper, after the children were washed and put to bed, Patrick first, then Frances, who negotiated strenuously for 15 more minutes and got 5, then James, who read in bed with a candle until Roy went in at 9 and took the candle, to James's dignified protest. Roy and Olive sat on the porch in the dark. The stars over the Texas hill country were remarkable. This was one of the things Roy had always known and Olive had learned upon arriving, that the sky here had a different quality than city sky, vast and deep, and full of light that was old beyond reckoning. They sat and watched it in the easy silence of people who have been together long enough that silence is a form of conversation. An owl called from the live oak down by the creek. One of the hounds moved in the yard. "Patrick is going to be a naturalist," Olive said. "I believe so," Roy said. "We should get him books," Olive said. "There are natural history societies in Austin. I read about one in William's paper." "Write to them," Roy said. "I will." A pause. "James is going to work the ranch," Roy said. "He wants to," Olive said. "I want to make sure he has the choice." "I will make sure," Roy said. "The ranch will be there for him if he wants it. It will also be there for him to leave if he needs to." "Frances," Olive said. "Frances," Roy said with the particular tone of a father who has understood, looking at his daughter on horseback, that this child is going to exceed every expectation, is going to do something we cannot currently predict. Olive smiled in the dark. "She is 5. She is already deciding things," Roy said. "You can see it in her." Olive could see it. Frances had a quality of determined forward motion that reminded her, sometimes, of the feeling she had had standing at the altar reading the telegram aloud, the moment when the uncertainty resolved and the direction became absolutely clear, and the only thing left was to do the thing. "She gets that from her father," Olive said. Roy looked at her in the dark. She could see his expression in the starlight, the slight adjustment of his features that was the nearest he usually got to visible surprise. "I spent most of 1882 being very careful and very patient," he said. "You spent most of 1882 being careful and patient, and then sent a telegram to stop a wedding," Olive said. "Which is not actually the behavior of a man without decisive qualities." Roy considered this. "I was decisive when it mattered," he said. "As am I," Olive said. "As is Frances." "She is going to terrify me for the rest of my life," Roy said. "Yes," Olive said with complete serenity. "And you are going to be inordinately proud of her for the same reasons." Roy reached across the space between their chairs and found her hand in the dark, and she turned her palm up to meet his, and they sat with the stars above the Texas hill country and the creek below the limestone ridge and the sleeping children inside the solid house, and the life they had built together was present around them like the limestone itself, unmovable, enduring, true. "Roy," Olive said. "Yes." "I am with child again," she said, in the same tone she had used in the spring of 1883, the tone that was simply stating what was true without drama, because the truth between them had never required drama to be felt. Roy's hand tightened around hers. "Are you certain?" he said, which was exactly what he had said the first time. "I am certain," she said, which was exactly what she had said then. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man receiving something large. "4," he said. "4," she confirmed. "The house," he started. "We will add to it," she said. "We have the limestone and you have the skill and we have the time." Roy thought about the north room that had been sitting mostly empty since Patrick graduated from the cradle, and about the limestone blocks that still came down the ridge road from the same quarry where he had bought the original building stone 19 years ago. "A fourth child," he said. "Yes," Olive said. "James will be insufferably responsible," Roy said. "He already is," Olive said. "It will simply give him a new arena. Frances will appoint herself in charge of everything." "She already has," Olive said. "That will also give her a new arena." "Patrick will watch it all with great scientific interest," Roy said. "He will take notes," Olive said. "And the fourth," Roy said, "we cannot predict." "No," Olive said. "Though if history is any guide," Roy said, "Vaughns tend to surprise you." Olive laughed, the real laugh that had been present in his life now for 13 years and that he still found, every single time, the best sound in the world. "Vaughns," she said, "tend to do what is necessary when it matters in the manner that is most likely to be permanent." Roy turned his head to look at her in the starlight, at her profile against the enormous Texas sky, at the woman who had arrived in Redemption Creek on an August afternoon in 1881, and had changed the entire shape of his life with her green eyes and her quality of genuine attention and her willingness to stand at an altar in front of the whole congregation, and read a stranger's telegram aloud, because she understood that the truth was the only foundation worth building anything on. "Permanent," he said. "Permanent," she said. The owl called again from the live oak. The creek ran on in the dark below the ridge. The stars continued their ancient passage over the limestone hills of the Texas Hill Country, indifferent and magnificent, as they had before and as they would after, while below them the small and important lives of people went on doing what they do, making choices, paying consequences, building things out of love and work and honest reckoning. Roy Vaughn had come to Redemption Creek in 1875 on a bay horse with a bedroll and an uncertain future, and he had built from it, slowly and carefully, something that was his in the deepest sense, not just the land or the house or the herd, but the life he shared with the woman beside him on the porch, the children sleeping inside the limestone walls, the friends across the creek, the work that had his hands all over it, the community that knew his name and what it meant. And at the center of it, permanent and true, was the fact that on a June afternoon in 1882, he had sent a telegram to stop a wedding, and Olive Keating had stood at the altar in her wedding dress and read it aloud to the whole congregation, and Preacher Aldous had continued anyway. And everything had followed from there, as it will, as it does, when the right people find each other at the right moment and are brave enough to do what truth requires. Olive squeezed his hand in the dark. Roy squeezed back, the stars moved, the creek ran on, and that was enough, more than enough, everything in fact.